The first thing I noticed about the house was the silence. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a thick, swallowing absence, as if the very air had been vacuumed of sound. The second thing I noticed was the dust. It didn't coat the surfaces so much as constitute them. A fine, gray skin that seemed to pulse gently in the weak light, filtering through the grimy bay windows. I should have turned and run, but I was desperate. And desperation is a key that unlocks every terrible door. My name is Eris, and I was drowning in medical debt, in grief, in the crushing weight of a future that had collapsed overnight. The inheritance of my great-aunt Eliera's secluded Victorian house was the only rope thrown my way. The lawyer's letter called it Whispering Pines, a charmingly rustic name that belied the reality of the place. There were no pines, whispering or otherwise. The house sat in a barren clearing, a gabled and turreted monstrosity of weathered black wood, hunched against the granite shoulder of a mountain as if trying to hide. The key, heavy and iron, felt like ice in my hand. The realtor, a Mr. Davison, had met me at the foot of the overgrown driveway, his smile a tight, nervous thing. "Full disclosure," he'd said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. "Though the day was cool, the place has been empty a long time. Since your aunt passed. 20 years. Locals say it's stubborn." He wouldn't elaborate, just handed me the key and practically fled in his sensible sedan, leaving me alone with the oppressive silence and the watching windows. Inside, the air was cold and carried a scent I couldn't. Place not mildew, not rot, but something older, like stone after a long rain, or the air inside a sealed tomb. My footsteps on the parquet floor were muffled, the sound dying the moment it was born. The furniture was shrouded in white sheets, casting long, ghost-like shadows. It should have felt creepy, but a strange sense of calm began to settle over me. The outside world, with its bills and its pitying stares, felt a million miles away. Here, there was only stillness. I found her study on the second floor. Unlike the other rooms, it was pristine. A massive oak desk, its surface bare and polished, stood before a window overlooking the stark mountains. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves were crammed with leather-bound volumes, their spines unmarked, and in the center of the room, resting on a small, velvet-lined pedestal, was a smooth, dark gray stone about the size of my fist. It was the source of the petrichor scent, somehow both faint and all-encompassing. It was unremarkable, and yet I couldn't look away. It felt attentive. That first night, I slept on a musty sofa in the parlor, wrapped in a blanket I'd brought from my old life. The silence was absolute, a blanket of its own, and in that silence, I heard it. A whisper. Not a voice, not words, but a sensation of sound, a vibration that seemed to come not through my ears but from inside my skull. It was the feeling of a page turning in a vast, ancient book, the soft sigh of shifting sand in a deep, dark place. I sat bolt upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. The house was still, the moonlit rooms full of nothing but furniture and shadows. I told myself it was the wind, the settling of an old structure, my own exhausted mind playing tricks. The days bled into a strange, quiet routine. I cleaned, airing out rooms that hadn't tasted fresh air in decades. The silence, once oppressive, became a companion. The dust, I noticed, no longer settled on my things. It was as if the house had accepted my presence, drawing a boundary around me. I spent hours in the study, my fingers tracing the unmarked spines of the books. I'd pick up the smooth stone, its cool weight of comfort in my palm. I started talking to it, voicing my fears, my loneliness. "At least I have you," I'd murmur, half joking. The stone, of course, never answered. But the silence that followed my words felt different, less empty, more like a held breath. A week in, I found the first journal. Tucked behind a loose brick in the study's fireplace was a small, cloth-bound book. The handwriting was my aunt's, a frantic, spidery script. The first entry was dated 60 years ago. "Father warned me," he said, "the tenant is restless. It dreams of deep oceans and older skies, and its dreams become the dust on the floorboards. We are the keepers, he said. The anchors. We do not leave. To leave is to let it wake. To let it wake is to... The rest of the page was torn away. My blood went cold. Tenant. Anchor. It was the rambling of a lonely old woman, Primera told myself. A product of isolation. But that night, as I lay in the bed, I'd now moved into the main bedroom. The whispering returned. This time, it was clearer. A single, resonant syllable that had no meaning, but carried the weight of epics. It didn't frighten me. Instead, a profound sense of belonging washed over me. A feeling of roots sinking deep into the earth below the house. This was my place. I was the keeper. Primera, Hua, Sihom. And in the deep, listening silence of the house, I felt something ancient begin to stir. The journal became my obsession. Its pages were a map of my aunt's slow unraveling, and with every entry, a cold dread took root in my own heart. A counterpoint to the strange comfort the house provided. She wrote of the tenant, never describing it, only its effects. How the patterns in the wood grain of the floors would sometimes writhe like slow, liquid snakes. How shadows would detach themselves from corners and stand watch at the foot of her bed, not malevolent, but observant. She wrote of the anchor, the duty of our bloodline to stay, to be a fixed point in its slow, dreaming thoughts. It is not a ghost, one entry read, the ink blotted as if by a trembling hand. It is older than ghosts. It is a fact of this place, like the mountain itself. We are the cairn placed upon it, a marker that says, something sleeps here. To abandon our post is to erase the marker. I found myself standing at the study window, the smooth stone cold in my hand, staring out at the brooding mountain. Was it sleeping? The idea was ludicrous, monstrous, and yet the silence of the house felt less like an absence, and more like a presence, a great, slumbering beast, breathing slowly in the dark. The whispers in the night grew more distinct. They were never words I could understand, but complex. Layered sounds that grind of continental plates, the pop of vacuum-sealed voids, the low hum of a starless night. They no longer came just when I was in bed. I'd be washing a dish and hear a soft, sibilant hiss from the empty pantry. I'd be reading and a guttural, clicking murmur would seem to emanate from the bookshelf itself. The house was no longer just still. It was attentive. Then, the changes began. I woke one morning to find the dust on the hallway floor arranged in intricate, swirling patterns. They weren't random. They looked like fractals, or the microscopic etchings on a fossil. When I tried to sweep them away, the broom seemed to push through molasses, and a profound sense of disapproval, cold and sharp, was set over me. I left the patterns alone after that. They were gone by the next day, replaced by a new, more complex design. A few days later, I reached for a can of soup from the pantry. My hand brushed against the stone wall, and for a fleeting second, the rough-hewn granite felt soft and porous, like pumice, and warm, like skin. I yanked my hand back, my heart in my throat. I stared at the wall. It was just a wall, but the memory of that fleeting, impossible texture lingered on my fingertips for hours. The final, undeniable proof came on a rain-lashed night. The wind howled around the gables, a wild, living sound that was a shock after weeks of silence. I was in the study, the journal open on the desk, the stone a familiar weight. Beside it, a particularly violent gust shook the house, and a framed photograph of my great-aunt, severe woman with my eyes fell from the mantelpiece, the glass shattering on the hearth. As I knelt to clean it up, the whispers in my mind coalesced into a single, sharp note of distress. It was a feeling, not a sound, a psychic equivalent of a wince. And then, the shadows in the room congealed. They pulled away from the walls, flowing like spilled ink across the floor, gathering around the shards of glass. I watched, frozen, as the tendrils of darkness gently, meticulously, began to push the fragments of glass and the photograph into a neat pile in the center of the rug, as if tidying up a mess. It was a careful, deliberate action, a protective one. It wasn't hostile. It was helping. I sank back onto my heels. My breath caught in my chest. These was real. The tenant was real. My aunt's journal wasn't the rambling of a madwoman. It was a field guide. The fear was still there. A cold knot in my stomach. But it was now tangled with a terrifying, burgeoning sense of connection. This entity, this ancient, slumbering consciousness, knew I was here. It was aware of me, and it had just, in its own incomprehensible way, communicated with me. I looked at the stone on the desk. It seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light, a trick of the stormy gloom. Surely, but I knew it wasn't. I was no longer just a resident in this house. I was a participant. The line between keeper and kept was beginning to blur, and I was no longer sure which side of it I was on. The incident with the shadows shattered the last of my denial. I was living with something. The house was not a structure. It was a shell, a chrysalis, for a being whose thoughts were the settling of dust and whose moods shifted the very texture of reality within its walls. The fear was still there, a constant, low-grade hum in my blood, but it was now secondary to annoying, terrifying curiosity. I had to know what it was. I had to see it. The journal's later entries became my grim scripture. Aunt Elara's writing grew more frantic, but also more lucid, as if the proximity to the tenant had sharpened her mind, even as it frayed her nerves. "It has no form we can comprehend," she wrote. "It is a pattern, a law of physics that should not be. To look upon it directly is to invite your own mind to unravel. But it can manifest. It uses what is at hand: dust, shadow, the memory of light on stone. It builds itself a puppet from the echoes of this place." She described a ritual, a way to facilitate a clearer manifestation. It wasn't spelled out as instructions, but pieced together from terrified musings. It required the anchor the stone a state of profound mental stillness from the keeper, and her offering not a sacrifice of blood or life, but of memory, a vivid, emotional memory, laid bare for it to examine. It was how she communicated with it, how she reinforced the anchor's bond. The thought made me nauseous, to deliberately open my mind to that presence. It was insanity. But the silence in the house was changing. The whispers were becoming more persistent, more inquisitive. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, my every thought and feeling being gently and inexorably probed. The need to understand, to meet the gaze of this invisible watcher, became an obsession stronger than the fear. I decided to do it in this study, the heart of it all. I waited until midnight. The time the journal implied was a thin hour. I sat on the floor, my back against the pedestal where the stone rested. I closed my eyes, trying to still the frantic hammering of my heart. I focused on the stone's cool, smooth presence against my spine, imagining roots of calm spreading from it into my body. The whispering in my mind softened, becoming a receptive, waiting silence. Now, the offering. I reached for the most potent memory I had, the raw, open wound that had driven me here in the first place. The moment the doctor had told me the cancer was back, and T's time it was terminal, I felt the cold plastic of the chair, saw the pity in his eyes, smelled the sterile, antiseptic air. I felt the bottom drop out of my world, the sheer, howling terror of my own ending. I didn't just remember it, I relived it, pouring every ounce of that fear, that grief, that profound loneliness into the silent, waiting presence of the house. For a moment, nothing. Then, the air left the room. It wasn't a wind, it was a vacuum. My ears popped, the temperature plummeted. My breath pluming in the sudden, frigid dark. The whispering returned, not as a distant murmur, but as a roaring cascade of sound inside my schooly screams of dying stars. The groan of shifting continents, the endless, lonely sigh of deep time. I clenched my eyes shut, my body trembling violently. A pressure began to build in front of me, a density of space that threatened to crush my bones. I forced my eyes open. The dust from the entire room was swirling in the air, a galaxy of gray particles caught in an unfelt wind. They were coalescing, drawing together, not into a human shape, but into something tall, slender, and multi-layered. It was a rough sketch of a form, composed of swirling filth and shadow, constantly shifting, arms of dust sprouting and dissolving like the legs of a centipede. At its core, where a heart might be, was a deeper darkness, a void that hurt to look at. This was the puppet. This was the tenant. It had no face, but I felt its attention, focus on me, a weight more physical than the house itself. It was studying the memory I had offered. The roaring in my mind shifted, and for a single, horrifying second, I felt an echo of my own terror reflected back at me. But it was alien, curious. My fear of death was a fascinating, ephemeral trinket to this thing that had likely existed before life itself. Then, it showed me something. Not an imaje, but a knowledge, implanted directly into my consciousness. I saw the Earth, young and molten. I saw the tenant's arrival, not in a ship, but as a seed of impossible reality, crashing into the infant planet and burrowing deep. It was a sleeper, a refugee from a war between universes. Its dreaming mind, over eons, subtly warped the geology, tainted the local physics, made this place quiet, safe for its slumber. My family, my bloodline, we weren't chosen. We were a side effect. We had built our home directly on its dreaming mind, and our consciousness, our simple human persistence, had become a tether. The anchor of the stone was a focus, a symbol of that bond. We kept its dreams from spilling out too far, from warping the world. We were the guardians of its sleep. The connection broke. I gasped, crumpling to the floor, vomit rising in my throat. The dust puppet dissolved, the particles raining down silently. The pressure vanished, and the air rushed back into the room. The whispers receded to their usual background hum. I lay there, sobbing, shivering, my mind scarred by the immensity of what I had touched. I wasn't just a home for something ancient. I was the warden of a god, and as I lay on the cold floor, the stone seeming to watch me from its pedestal, a new, more terrifying thought dawned. My aunt's final, torn journal entry, to let it wake is too. I was dying. What would happen to the anchor when I was gone? The knowledge was a cancer in my soul, more invasive than the one rotting my body. I was a dead woman, sitting on a world-ending fault line. The tenant's revelation had not been a gift of understanding, but a sentence. My family's duty was not just a tradition. It was a critical, planetary failsafe, and I was about to be the one who failed. The house knew. In the days that followed my communion, the atmosphere shifted from attentive to anxious. The whispering was a constant, worried static in the back of my thoughts. The dust patterns on the floor became jagged, chaotic, like seismograph readings of a coming earthquake. Shadows flitted at the edge of my vision with a new, frantic energy. The tenant was dreaming fitfully, and its dreams were beginning to leak. Small, impossible things started to happen. A water glass left on the nightstand would be found filled with a dark, briny liquid that smelled of deep ocean trenches. The books in the study, when I opened them, no longer showed words but intricate, pulsating geometric patterns that made my eyes water. One morning, I walked into the parlor and found the far wall was gone, replaced by a vista of a swirling, violet nebula streaked with impossible colors. I stumbled back, my heart seizing, and when I looked again, it was just the old, faded wallpaper. The barrier between the tenant's dream reality and our own was thinning, stretched to its breaking point by my impending demise. I scoured the journal again, desperately seeking an answer my aunt had missed. There had to be a way to pass on the anchor, to find another keeper. But her writings were clear. The bond was one of blood and prolonged exposure. It had taken her years to fully establish her connection after her father died. I had weeks, maybe less. My body was failing. The fatigue was a lead weight in my bones, and the pain was a constant, gnawing companion I could no longer fully suppress with the dwindling pills from my old life. I spent most of my time in the study, slumped in the chair, my hand resting on the stone. It was no longer cool. It throbbed with a faint, warm rhythm, like a sluggish heartbeat. I could feel the tenant's distress through it, a low, resonant thrum of panic that mirrored my own. It was during one of these long, painful vigils that the final, horrifying solution presented itself. It didn't come from the journal. It came from the Tenant itself. I was drifting in a haze of pain, my head on the desk, when the whisper in my mind changed. The chaotic noise streamlined, focusing, and formed a single, clear concept. Not a word, but an image, a feeling, an absolute knowing. It showed me the stone, the anchor. It showed me the bond, not as a tether, but as a conduit. And it presented a new, terrifying possibility. The anchor didn't have to be passed on. It could be consumed. The bond could be made permanent. My consciousness, my dying, fading spark, could be fused with the stone. I wouldn't just be the keeper. I would become the anchor, a perpetual, undying warden for the sleeper. My awareness would remain, trapped in the stone, feeling the eons grind past, a silent, screaming sentinel in the dark, forever. The sheer, cosmic horror of the proposition made me want to vomit. It was a fate worse than death, worse than oblivion, an eternity of solitude, a feeling the Tenant's vast, alien dreams wash over me, unable to move, or speak, or die. No! I screamed the word in my mind, pushing back against the presence. Primera would not. Primera would not. I would rather die. I would rather let the world fracture than endure that. A wave of, not anger, but profound, universe-shaking fear erupted from the Tenant. The house groaned around me, the floorboards buckling like wet cardboard. The window overlooking the mountain shattered inwards, not with a crash, but silently, the glass turning to fine, white sand in midair. The shadows in the room solidified into grasping, frantic tendrils that clawed at the air. The puppet of dust and void began to form again, but it was trembling, unstable. It was afraid. Truly, deeply afraid. Not of me, but of waking, of being found, of the war it had fled. And in that moment, I understood the true, sickening twist. My aunt, her final, torn page. I knew how it ended. She hadn't died of old age or illness. She had chosen this. Faced with her own mortality, she had performed this same terrible ritual. She had consumed the anchor. Her consciousness was in the stone. I had been speaking to her, feeling her presence all along. The strange sense of calm I'd felt, the profound sense of belonging that wasn't just the house. Idwash. Here, she was the comforting presence, the guide, trying to ease my path toward the same damnation. The stone on the desk was not just a focus. It was my great-aunt Alara's tomb, and now it was offering to be mine. The choice was no choice at all. It was the selection of a nightmare. On one hand, a final, peaceful surrender to the cancer. My own end, a private, terrible thing. But in my wake, the unraveling of reality. The waking of the sleeper. The Tenant, startled into consciousness, would be a cataclysm. Its mere wakefulness would be a geological event. Its fear and confusion rewriting the local laws of physics. The mountain would likely cease to be a mountain. The world would not end with a bang, but with a silent, fundamental rewriting, a page torn from the book of existence. On the other hand, an eternity. A consciousness trapped in a stone, fused with the fading echo of my aunt, a silent witness to the dreams of a god. No death, no release, only an ever-deepening well of solitude amidst the cosmic noise. It was a fate so monstrous, my mind recoiled from it. I looked at the stone, my hand trembling as I reached for it. It was warm now, pulsing with a gentle, rhythmic light. Aunt Alara's presence was a soft, desperate plea within it. Stay, please. It is the only way. The house gave one last, agonized groan. A crack splintered up the study wall, and from it bled not plaster and lath, but a deep, cold blackness that smelled of the void between stars. The Tenant's fear was a physical force, pressing in on me. It wasn't malicious. It was a child, about to be woken into a battlefield. I thought of the world outside, the bustling, oblivious towns, the people with their small, beautiful, fleeting lives. They would never know what saved them, or what price was paid. They would never know the silent, screaming warden in the dark. A profound, weary acceptance settled over me. My life had been defined by an ending. It was a bitter poetry to now be defined by an unending. I closed my fingers around the stone. It was no longer smooth. It felt like skin, like a frantic heartbeat. "All right," I whispered, my voice cracking. "All right." I didn't know the ritual, but I didn't need to. The tenant did. The moment I consented, the process began. It was not violent, but it was utterly violating. A pressure started in the center of my skull, a feeling of my mind being physically pulled, drawn out through my eyes, my mouth, my pores. I felt my awareness separating from my body, the pain and fatigue of my cancer-ridden shell suddenly becoming a distant, fading signal. I saw my own body slump forward onto the desk, a final breath sighing out, a marionette with its strings cut. Then the compression, an agony of infinity. My consciousness was forced into the stone, folded, spooled, and packed into a space that was both impossibly small and vaster than a galaxy. For a moment, there was only panic and a scream that had no sound. Then, stillness. A new kind of perception bloomed. I could feel the grain of the pedestal beneath me. I could feel the vast, slumbering weight of the tenant beneath the house. Its streams now a river flowing around me, through me. I could feel the slow, patient turn of the planet, and I could feel her Aladdin, a faint weathered presence, like a message carved into a tree, worn smooth by centuries of rain. There was no conversation, only SRA'd eternal vigil. Time lost, meaning. Days, years, centuries, they were just subtle shifts in the light through the study window, the slow accumulation of dust that no longer feared me because I was now a part of it. I was the stillness in the house. I was the silence. I was the anchor. Final stinger, decades later. A car cautiously navigates the overgrown driveway. A man and a woman get out, their clothes crisp and new, a stark contrast to the decaying